RVA originally. He's a professor of African American history at ODU, and his dissertation, paraphrased from the University of Georgia website, his dissertation on racial reconciliation in the modern South focuses on RVA from Brown v. Board to the present. And he's the newest member of our collective, so yay!
Good morning to you all. So yes, I am the least accomplished person here giving a speech, but I am very happy that you reached out to me and that I can speak to you all about racism and urban planning. So I focus in my own scholarship on racial reconciliation in the modern South, basically saying how does the modern South post-Brown or civil rights movement to now, how does it get less racist over time? And in order to understand that, you have to understand urban planning. And when you look back at urban planning from city to city throughout the nation, it's pretty racist, just all the way through. And it's like, so that's basically what I'm going to talk about today. So, where do I start with racist urban planning in Richmond? Anna has already covered pretty much the colonial era, but I'm gonna have to go back there because that's really where it begins. So when Richmond was first started as just a rural outpost in the colonial world, it really wasn't thought of to be a major city. It was never thought that it would potentially be a major city, but in essence, enslaved hands still had to come in and deforest and drain the swamps to help create this rural outpost that eventually, because of the Revolution, became the capital of Virginia. And so with the Revolution, Richmond becomes again the capital of Virginia, going towards the antebellum period, and that's really where urban planning becomes a lot more formalized as just a thing. That city leaders, as in elected officials and businessmen, come together to try to figure out exactly how do we organize this landscape. And so during the antebellum period, Richmond was really the best of both worlds because America was in essence a unenslaved North or free North and an enslaved South. The West was kind of working itself out all throughout the early 1800s. But Richmond itself was a unique place because it was one of the very few cities where you had slavery as an institution that had social ramifications and also economic ramifications. But then it was also an industrialized place. So Richmond was really the perfect marriage between the capitalist industrial North and the slave South. The most American, or one of the most American cities that really could have existed. And especially with the production, consumption, and transportation of things like flour, tobacco, iron, etc. Right? Enslaved people are working in these industries. They're working in the factories alongside of free blacks, alongside of working class whites, who are all working for rich white people in essence. But that's antebellum Richmond in essence. Slavery does formalize race relations. It formalizes social relations in a way in which you don't really need to have a lot of laws and things in place to organize the city because slavery did it for us. All right, slavery did it for them. Of course, free black people who lived in Richmond. I think the majority of free blacks in Virginia did live in Richmond at one point during the antebellum period. I mean, they had their own neighborhoods. They lived in their own areas, places where whites would allow them to exist. They had their own churches, of course. But in essence, slavery did, again, stratify everything. That was until the Civil War, right? And so the Civil War happens, of course, April 2nd, 1865, April 3rd, 1865, I believe Richmond burns. Again, don't quote me on the date, but I'm pretty sure it does. But Richmond burns a lot on those 2 days. Of course, the surrender, I believe, was on April 3rd when Mayor Mayo, right? Went out. Yes, you're shaking your head. Yes. Okay. Perfect. Good. Because this is not my time period. But Richmond surrenders, or Richmond's leaders, or Confederate leaders surrender, and black people in Richmond do what black people throughout the South do. Right. So they begin to use the streets that were once places of enslavement. They use them as a terrain to negotiate their freedom. So, a black person couldn't be out without a pass in Richmond, in antebellum Richmond. Now, after the Civil War, what do black people do? They go outside, right? They go outside, they drink, they buy guns, they buy alcohol, they celebrate, they sing, they don't show deference to whites. They really do use Richmond's landscape in and of itself as a contested terrain, saying that this is what emancipation looks like. It looks like black people doing what was it? Eric Foner quoted slave, and I should know his name. My advisor would be angry at me right now. But Eric Foner quotes a slave who says, "If I cannot do as a white man, am I really free?" Right? And that's what black people did after Richmond burns. They surrender, and then of course the war is over. And so in response to that, white Richmonders, mainly ex-Confederates, Confederate sympathizers, they begin to get into that contested terrain and begin to use things that we now call black codes to pretty much put an end to that behavior. So one of the biggest things, or one of the most prevalent tools they used was police, right? Using police to go around and to round up blacks who were vagrants, as they would call it, and they put them in what they call Negro bullpens, right, which are just open air jails where you could just see people sitting in cages and you could walk around and mock them. And the people who would be put in there were, again, black people who acted who acted out of line, black people who did things that they knew they were not supposed to do. So, you didn't tip your hat to a white person, cool, you're going to jail now. And so a response to that was Reconstruction. Right? Reconstruction was a response to that, and in Richmond, black people took an active part in Reconstruction, and of course, I believe between 30 and 40 black people served on the city council between 1868, 1869, all the way until the 1890s. And a lot of that representation comes out of Jackson Ward, Monroe Ward, and it's with that period, that critical period, that Richmond does, in essence, still operate like an Old South city. It still operates economically as an Old South city, culturally as an Old South city. But by the 1890s, that's when the New South finally touches Richmond. And that's when city planning gets, again, way more formalized, way more organized. And so, in essence, I forgot who brought it up, Anna or Sarah, but the Constitution of 1902, of course, which that is always the pinpoint. Like, oh, this is the place where black people were pushed from the polls. But before that, in the 1880s, there were a series of violent encounters between white Virginia Democrats and black voters. They were called the Jackson Ward robberies. And so this is how it would take place. You'd have law enforcement and white Virginia Democrats with guns and bats, and they go to polls and they would make sure that black people don't vote. And then if you were someone willing to go and take a beating or get shot and vote, then they would just switch the vote out anyway, right? So in essence, that was happening all before the 1902 Constitution, and because of that, white Southerners, and this was happening all throughout the country, white Southerners said that we need to clean up elections, right? We need to clean up elections because elections are becoming too dirty, and this is all a part of the early progressive movement. We need to clean up government, and so the idea was that we need to get rid of black people from voting because they are causing white men to cheat. Right, white men would not have to be violent at the polls if black people just didn't show up, and so that was the reasoning. Sounds crazy, but that was the reasoning. And so of course the 1902 Constitution hits here, and so black people are now pushed away from the polls. They're no longer voting in large numbers. They no longer have political power. And so with their political power taken away here, specifically in Virginia and in Richmond, New South elites, business elites, of course, now want to, again, take Richmond from being this antebellum city to being a new, modern, industrial city. And so the way in which they organized it was to trap poor black people into the interior of the city as the city expands out north, well, not really east per se, but north, south, and west, through various annexations. So Richmond's buying land, the city itself is expanding, buying land, and a part of that was, of course, Monument Avenue, right? And so as it's going out, it's becoming more suburbanized. Streetcar suburbs pop up all over the place, and middle class and upper class people would move there and bring tax revenue to the state, or bring tax revenue, to the city, and black people would be confined to the inner core of the city, again, Jackson Ward and places like that. And a visual reminder of this would be, of course, the statues along Monument Avenue, which again made a political statement that told black Richmonders who was organizing the city, who ran the city. Right? It was an old South. It was a visual reminder that the old South mentality had not really gone away from the New South. And so, as blacks are pushed from the polls, Richmond is growing. More people are moving here. Jim Crow comes to town, right? So in Jim Crow culture, it always existed in Richmond, but Jim Crow laws did not really until the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so was it the 1910, 1911 was when the first real segregation ordinance hits Richmond. We were A famous historian said Baltimore was the first city to implement it. I argue in my article in the Journal of African American History, by the way, that Richmond was. That Richmond was the first city to implement it, and so they do, right? So the segregation ordinance. You have to know the name of the guy who pushes for it. He was a white working class dude who rose up in the ranks of the Democratic Party. I believe his name was John Epps. John Epps, EPPS. So again, I wrote this article a while ago. But John Epps really pushes for it, and he argues that pushing for this segregation ordinance is going to really push Richmond into the future because everyone's doing it. Everyone's segregating black people. Richmond needs to get on board with doing that. And so with that behind that segregation ordinance comes tons of other segregation laws. Again, blacks are given separate treatment at theaters and hotels, and again, all this was already happening throughout the city. But codifying it and formalizing it into law put Richmond in step with other major cities throughout the country. And it was with that Richmond becomes a quote unquote modern city. So part of becoming a modern city is having legal codes in place to trap black people into the inner, or at least to sections of a city. And Richmond would be the inner core. And again, as you go out, as you fan out and go towards more rural parts or less developed parts, it would become more suburbanized, more spacious, nicer homes, things of that nature. So for those who lived in Richmond for a while, that should make some sense. And so that was Richmond. That was the way that urban planning happened in the early 20th century. And so as we get to the mid-century, by World War II, that plan backfires. Okay, that plan backfires, and not because of any urban protests or uprisings, but it was because middle class or white people in Richmond start earning more money during World War II. Why? War industries. And what do these people who work in war industries want, or businesses that contract with the federal government want? They want houses. They want homes. And the homes in the inner core of the city were dilapidated. There was no care given to, or very little care given to infrastructure, and so these people started running to Henrico and Chesterfield County like crazy, especially in the late 1940s, early 1950s. I mean, you start to see it in the census records. By 1950, it is very clear that as whites are moving to the Richmond area to work, they're not living in Richmond. They're just not. And also, there is a lot of people leaving Richmond. And so for the first time in city history, Richmond was dealing with a serious white exodus. And so that lack of care for the inner city really did come back to bite the city fathers. And so a new breed of young politician was dealing with Richmond at that time. So before, in the early 1900s, it was very conservative, very conservative, arch conservative in terms of fiscal policy, right? People who, your your Harry Bird guys, right? You only spend what you have. You don't take out any loans to build anything. Those guys are gone by World War II. So the guys who were coming in after World War II were young. These were lawyers, businessmen, and they wanted to, again, make sure Richmond was in step with the rest of the nation. And so what are other cities doing? They are, in essence, demolishing large parts of their inner city by putting highways through them and connecting them to the growing suburbs. Urban planning by the 1950s was planning for the urban scene's demise, right? The city is dying. America's becoming a suburban nation. We need to plan for that by putting highways here, connecting people to their jobs and places like that. So the young guys who are coming in and running Richmond or the newer guys rather, coming in running Richmond by the 1940s, 1950s begin to do that. And a part of them putting highways through Richmond, highways, interstates, they have to tear down parts of the city. The parts of the city they start tearing down, as you guys know, parts of Jackson Ward. Later it'll be Idlewood, what was it, Navy Hill. Other black neighborhoods were being targeted, or were targeted by the late 50s, early 60s, with early 50s going into the 60s. They were being targeted for being demolished, in essence, because they were slums, right? They were slums, and they would be the foundation of Richmond's new place in this new urban world. Again, a city that is heavily suburbanized, that is suburban focused, so always looking towards its outer rim, never looking towards its inner core. And with that, black people would be at the would be bearing the brunt of that, and so. By the end of the modern civil rights era, historians would say around 1968, because that's the Fair Housing Act. That would be the end of the modern civil rights era as we know it. Urban planning remains suburban focused. So from then really until the present, it remains suburban focused. So by the 1970s, 1980s. In Richmond, the city leadership changes, as you guys know. Late 1970s, of course, black Richmonders get into positions of power throughout the city, but the city council and the mayor's office is obviously the most notable. And so, although they hated to work with white elites in Richmond, I mean, they really did not like to work with them. They did work with them on renovating and changing the way in which Richmond looked in its inner core, again, where black people lived. And so a part of that was helping VCU expand and grow. We would not see the benefits, as a city, would not see the benefits of that really until the early 2000s. Another one was restoring historic houses, places like Churchill. Again, really wouldn't start to see that materialize until most recently. Another one would be revitalization projects like Project One and the 6th Street Marketplace and other ones that would beautify the city, make it a place that white people want to come back to. I mean, they are saying this explicitly, right? You know, they want to make it a place that white middle class people would come in and shop and spend their money and hopefully want to live. And so a huge issue with this is that if they want whites to come back, where are the black people going to go, right? Because there is a huge pockets of immobile black people who lived in Richmond, and they're immobile because of the economy. The economy does not allow for them to earn enough money to either leave or to afford housing, which I forgot to say was when the highway removal was happening in the 50s and 60s. There was a lot of displacement. There was like a 15,000 person waiting list for public housing in Richmond. That's as high as it got in the 1960s and 70s. And so what was the solution? Dump black people in the east end of the city, Churchill, right? North Churchill. That became one of the solutions to that, or the literal solution to that problem. And so with the 1970s, 1980s projects, there was no solution to that, right? So there's been this slow trickling of black people out of Richmond, and again, we really don't see it start. We didn't see it materialize until about the early 2000s, with black people leaving Richmond. And the two programs that I can think of off the top of my head, one would be Hope, and some of you all may know about that. The one that got rid of Blackwell, the Blackwell project down in Southside. The other one would be the 1995 tax abatements, which allowed for people to move back into the city with 15 years of deferred taxes. And with that, of course, property values rise, utilities rise, and then you have black homeowners who can't afford to live here anymore. And so I'm saying all of that, and I'll end it with this, is that urban plan, and although the modern South obviously gets less racist over time in terms of civic culture, in terms of just more integration between the races and neighborhoods and churches, undergirding that is just urban planning that is consistently going against the interest of black people, consistently. And so when people protest Monument, or the statues that were on Monument Avenue, and the one that's still there, when people protest Monument Avenue, they're not just talking about the statues, in my opinion. They're really talking about the consistency by which urban planning operates against the interest of black people. Because Richmond's issues are not just in Richmond. Richmond's history is not just in Richmond. It's happening in places like Atlanta, and places like Charlotte, Memphis, Nashville, you name it. I mean, it's all over the South. And so, yeah, so I'll leave it there because I know you all want to get up and go stretch your legs. So, and you said we're taking questions later, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect, cool. So, yep, that's it.